I never imagined that one of the most expensive lessons my next-door neighbor's family would ever learn would start with something as ordinary as my driveway. But after they ignored every polite conversation I tried to have, the final bill they ended up paying climbed well past $2,000. And the strange part is that I honestly don't think any of it had to happen. My name's Ethan Parker, and for the last 11 years I've lived in the same quiet neighborhood just outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio. The kind of place where people wave while mowing their lawns. Kids ride bicycles until the streetlights come on. And most disagreements get settled with a cup of coffee instead of lawyers or police reports. That's exactly why I bought my house. After spending nearly 2 decades working unpredictable hours as a commercial HVAC technician, I wanted somewhere peaceful, somewhere that felt predictable. My driveway wasn't anything special, just 2 lanes of concrete running beside the house into a detached garage, but it was mine. Every summer, I'd pressure wash it, seal the concrete, repaint the white boundary lines where they had faded, and keep it looking cleaner than most people kept their living rooms. Some folks joked that I treated that driveway like another member of the family, and maybe they weren't entirely wrong. Across the fence lived Russell Donovan, a retired insurance salesman who always had an opinion about everything. Russell wasn't a terrible guy, at least not in the beginning. He just carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the rules somehow bent around him. His son, Tyler, was in his late 20s and stopped by several times a week, supposedly to help his dad with errands or yard work. Although from what I could tell, most of those visits involved drinking coffee on the back patio while scrolling through his phone. The first time Tyler parked in my driveway, I figured it was an honest mistake. I came home around lunchtime after finishing an emergency repair call, turned onto my street, and immediately saw his black pickup sitting squarely across my driveway entrance. I couldn't pull in. I couldn't back into the garage. I couldn't even unload the equipment filling the back of my van. So I waited. I figured he'd notice eventually. 15 minutes later, he finally walked outside carrying an iced coffee like he'd just spent a relaxing afternoon instead of blocking someone else's property. He looked at me through the windshield, gave a casual little shrug, and said, "Man, relax." I was only inside for a second. I remember smiling even though I didn't feel like smiling. "It was 15 minutes, I answered. "Next time just park on the street. There's plenty of room." "Yeah, sure," he replied without even looking at the driveway as he climbed into his truck. I honestly believed that would be the end of it. People make mistakes. I've made plenty myself. But 2 days later, I came home early again. And there it was. Same truck, same spot, same problem. This time, I didn't wait for Tyler. I walked next door and knocked on Russell's front door. He answered wearing old jeans covered in grass stains, holding a garden hose in one hand. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Actually, I wanted to ask you a favor," I said calmly. "Tyler parked in my driveway again. Would you mind asking him not to do that anymore?" Russell didn't even hesitate. He laughed, actually laughed. Then he waved one hand dismissively like I'd interrupted something important. "He's not hurting anything," he said. "You're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be." I remember standing there for a second longer than I probably should have. It wasn't what he said that bothered me. It was how casually he dismissed the fact that someone was using my property without permission. I wasn't asking him to rebuild a fence or replace a damaged tree. I was asking him not to block my own driveway. "I just want to be able to get into my garage," I said. "That's all." Russell smiled in that irritating way people do when they've already decided they're right. "Come on, Ethan. It's only for a few minutes." I nodded once. "All right." Then I walked back across my lawn. I never raised my voice. I never argued. But something changed in my head during those 30 steps back to my front door. I realized there are people who hear kindness as weakness. And every time you solve their problem for them, they quietly convince themselves they're entitled to keep creating it. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open instead of watching baseball like I usually did. I looked up my city's parking ordinances, then called the non-emergency municipal office the next morning just to make sure I understood the law correctly. The woman who answered was surprisingly helpful. She confirmed that blocking access to a private residential driveway was a towable violation under city code. And unlike parking violations on public streets, there was no requirement that the property owner issue another warning first. I thanked her, wrote down the ordinance number, and saved it in my phone. Then I searched for the highest-rated licensed towing company in the county and saved their direct dispatch number under one simple contact name, driveway. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't hoping Tyler would park there again. I was simply preparing for the possibility that my neighbors had mistaken patience for permission. And deep down, something told me it wouldn't be very long before I found out whether I was right. The answer came faster than I expected. The following Tuesday, I pulled out of a supply warehouse a little before noon after grabbing a compressor motor for a customer across town. And for some reason, I had this strange feeling that I ought to head home first instead of going straight to the job site. I still can't explain why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just experience. Either way, as I turned onto Maple Creek Lane, there it was again. Tyler's black pickup sat perfectly centered across my driveway entrance like someone had painted it there. I actually laughed to myself. Not because it was funny, but because everything suddenly became very simple. There wasn't any anger left. No frustration, just clarity. I pulled over across the street, parked legally against the curb, reached into the cup holder, and tapped one contact on my phone. Driveway. The dispatcher answered before the second ring. County Recovery Services. How can we help you? I gave her my address, explained that an unauthorized vehicle was blocking access to my private residential driveway, confirmed that I was the property owner, and within 3 minutes, she had already dispatched a truck. Estimated arrival? About 12 minutes, she said. Perfect, I replied. Then I waited with the windows down, sipping lukewarm coffee while watching birds hop across the neighbor's lawn. It was strangely peaceful. About 10 minutes later, the tow truck rounded the corner. The driver, a stocky guy named Mike, according to the patch on his uniform, climbed out carrying a clipboard. You, Ethan? He asked. That's me. I pointed toward the truck. Private driveway. No permission. He looked once, nodded, snapped a few photos with his company tablet, checked the VIN, and started lowering the wheel lift. Everything happened with the kind of efficiency that comes from someone who has done the same job thousands of times. Halfway through loading the truck, Tyler finally came jogging out of Russell's front door holding a half-eaten sandwich. Whoa, 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 he shouted. What are you doing? Mike didn't even look up. Removing an illegally parked vehicle. Tyler stared at me like I had just betrayed some unwritten neighborhood code. Seriously, Ethan? He yelled. You couldn't knock? I met his eyes. I already did. Twice. For a moment I thought he might actually understand. Instead, he rolled his eyes, muttered something under his breath, and pulled out his phone, probably calling his father. By the time Russell hurried across the yard, breathing hard and waving both arms, Tyler's truck was already halfway onto the flatbed. This is ridiculous, Russell shouted before he even reached me. He's just visiting. I kept my voice calm. He's visiting while blocking my driveway. It would have taken 30 seconds to come tell us. It took me 2 conversations to tell you. That stopped him for exactly 1 second. Then he started talking louder. Funny how some people believe increasing the volume automatically strengthens the argument. Mike interrupted without looking away from the chains he was tightening. Sir, if you've got an issue with the tow, you'll need to take it up with dispatch or the city. Once the vehicle's hooked, it goes. Russell glared at me like I'd personally invented parking laws. Tyler threw his sandwich into the grass, climbed into his father's SUV, and they sped off toward the impound yard. I went inside, grabbed my lunch from the refrigerator, and left for my service call. By the time I finished replacing the compressor motor that afternoon, I'd almost forgotten about the whole thing. Almost. Around 6 that evening, my doorbell rang. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. Russell stood there with his jaw clenched, Tyler beside him looking equally irritated. That tow cost $280, Russell snapped. Good, I answered. He blinked. I don't think that was the response he expected. You think this is funny? No, I said honestly. I think it was avoidable. Tyler folded his arms. You made a huge deal out of nothing. No, I corrected him quietly. You made my driveway your parking spot after I asked you twice not to. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Finally, Russell shook his head. You're unbelievable. Maybe, I replied. But my driveway's empty now. They walked away without another word. My wife, Emily, had watched the entire exchange through the living room window. As soon as I closed the door, she looked at me and asked, Think that's finally over? I honestly believed it was. Most reasonable people learn after paying nearly $300 for a mistake. Apparently, I had overestimated how reasonable they were. 3 weeks passed quietly. Summer rolled on. Emily and I hosted a barbecue one Saturday. The neighbors across the street came over. Kids chased each other with water balloons. Russell stayed inside his house all afternoon with the blinds half closed, which honestly suited me just fine. I figured we'd all silently agreed to leave each other alone. Then came another Tuesday. Funny how Tuesdays kept becoming the interesting days. That morning I finished work early because a customer canceled at the last minute. Emily had texted asking if I could pick up groceries before dinner, so I swung by the supermarket and headed home around 1 o'clock. As I turned onto my street, my stomach sank before I even reached my mailbox. Tyler's truck wasn't just blocking my driveway this time. It was parked so tightly across the entrance that my van couldn't even angle around it. Worse yet, my wife's SUV was still inside the garage. She had planned to leave for an appointment in less than 30 minutes. I checked my phone. Right on schedule, another message from Emily. Leaving in 25. You almost home? I stared at Tyler's truck for maybe 5 seconds. There wasn't even a debate inside my head anymore. I called the tow company before I shifted the van into park. Mike answered this time instead of dispatch. Back again? He asked with a chuckle after hearing my address. Afraid so. We'll be there in 10. While I waited, Emily stepped out the front door carrying her purse. She looked at the truck, then at me, and slowly raised one eyebrow. Seriously? I nodded. Apparently $300 wasn't educational enough. She laughed. Well, tuition's about to go up. That line still makes me smile every time I remember it. 10 minutes later, Mike arrived with another driver because they happened to be finishing another call nearby. Tyler must have looked outside just as the trucks backed into position because this time he came sprinting down the front porch steps before they even lowered the lift. Don't you dare touch my truck, he yelled. Mike calmly held up a hand. Too late. I'm moving it, Tyler shouted. Once the hook's connected, company policy says it goes, Mike answered. You can discuss it at the impound office. Tyler looked at me with absolute disbelief. You called them again? You parked there again. You could have texted me. I couldn't help smiling. Interesting. I don't remember giving you my number. Russell stormed outside seconds later, red-faced enough that I honestly wondered if his blood pressure was okay. This is harassment, he yelled. Actually, Mike interrupted, blocking a private driveway is the violation here. Russell ignored him completely. He jabbed a finger toward me. You're enjoying this. I thought about that for a second before answering. No. I'm enjoying being able to use property I pay taxes on. That seemed to hit him harder than yelling ever could have. Tyler stood there helplessly while his truck disappeared down the street for the second time. What neither of them realized in that moment was that the tow itself wasn't about to become their biggest problem. Their real mistake wouldn't happen until the next morning, when Russell decided he was going to prove the city had treated his family unfairly. And in doing so, accidentally invited officials to start asking questions nobody in his household wanted answered. Russell filed his complaint first thing the next morning, convinced the city would agree that towing Tyler's truck had been excessive, and if he'd simply accepted the second tow as an expensive lesson, the story probably would have ended there. Instead, he demanded a formal review, insisting that I had somehow abused the system to target his family. The woman at the municipal office politely explained that every contested tow automatically triggered an administrative review of the circumstances surrounding the violation. Russell must have thought that sounded like good news. He had no idea he had just invited the city to examine something nobody had bothered looking at before. 2 code enforcement officers showed up on our street that Friday afternoon. They measured curb clearances, photographed the sidewalks, checked sight lines, and pulled previous parking complaints from their records. I happened to be washing my truck when one of the inspectors introduced himself and asked a few routine questions about the blocked driveway. I answered honestly, showed him the security camera footage from both towing incidents, and that was the end of my involvement. What happened next had nothing to do with me. As the officers reviewed additional footage, they noticed something Russell and Tyler apparently considered completely normal. Tyler hadn't just been blocking my driveway. On nearly every visit, he'd been leaving the rear of his truck hanging across the public sidewalk, forcing parents with strollers, kids on bicycles, and anyone using a wheelchair to move into the street to get around it. The inspectors went back through prior observations, documented multiple separate violations, and before leaving, they issued 2 citations for repeated sidewalk obstruction. Between the fines, administrative fees, the 2 tow bills, storage charges, and the late release fee from leaving the truck overnight after the second tow, the total climbed well beyond $2,000. Ironically, none of the biggest expenses came from me. They came from Russell's own decision to challenge something that had been completely justified from the beginning. About a week later, I was trimming the hedges along my front walk when Russell slowly wandered over. He looked different. Not defeated exactly, just tired. Pride has a way of exhausting people when they spend too much energy protecting it. He stood there quietly for several seconds before speaking. "I guess Tyler shouldn't have parked there." I leaned against the hedge trimmer and waited. "Probably not," I said. Another long silence settled between us. Then he surprised me. "I should have listened the first time you came over." That was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him. Maybe the closest thing he was capable of giving. I nodded once. That's all I wanted. He looked toward my driveway, now completely empty as usual. "I honestly thought you were making a mountain out of a molehill." I smiled a little. "Most property disputes start that way." He let out a small laugh, the first genuine one I'd heard from him in months. Turns out that mountain was expensive. It usually is. From that day forward, Tyler parked on the street like every other visitor in the neighborhood. Sometimes he had to walk another 50 feet to reach his father's front door. Somehow, he survived the inconvenience. Funny how impossible problems suddenly become manageable once they start costing real money. The atmosphere on our street gradually returned to normal. Kids rode bikes again without weaving around pickup trucks. Delivery drivers could actually see the sidewalk. Emily joked that she missed hearing the tow truck because it had become part of our Tuesday routine. And every now and then, Mike from the towing company would wave if he happened to drive through the neighborhood on another call. We never needed his services again. Looking back, the strangest part wasn't that I called the tow company. It was how long I waited before doing it. I gave warnings. I had calm conversations. I knocked on doors. I tried to be neighborly because that's the kind of community I wanted to live in. But somewhere along the way, I learned something that has stayed with me ever since. Kindness only works when both people respect it. If one person keeps treating courtesy like permission, eventually the most respectful thing you can do for yourself is stop negotiating with someone who has already decided your boundaries don't matter. Enforcing those boundaries isn't revenge. It isn't being petty. It's simply refusing to let someone else redefine what belongs to you. Even now, every time I pull into my driveway after a long day of work, I appreciate something I used to take for granted. It's just a strip of concrete leading to my garage, but it's mine. And every peaceful drive home reminds me that sometimes the quietest victories come from calmly standing your ground instead of raising your voice. Now I'm curious what you think. After the first warning, would you have called the tow company the second time? Or would you have kept knocking on the door hoping they'd finally respect your property? Let me know down in the comments because I honestly think this is one of those situations where reasonable people can disagree. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who kept crossing the line, I'd love to hear how you handled it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real neighborhood drama, and share this with someone who's ever had to teach an entitled neighbor that private property isn't public parking.